Good afternoon, everyone. My name is James Williams. I'm a member of the Criminology program at York, and I would like to welcome all of you on behalf of the program to our 2012 Criminology lecture. This year we are very fortunate to have Mike Levi from the School of Social Sciences in Cardiff University. Mike has been kind enough to make the long journey here for what has turned out to be a relatively short trip. And we sincerely appreciate his efforts in coming. Many of you will know Mike by reputation alone as one of the most prolific and influential scholars in the field of financial fraud and organized crime. His book, Phantom Capitalists, first published in 1981, remains a gold standard in the field, and he has since published numerous articles and book chapters on topics ranging from organized crime to money laundering to terrorist financing to cybercrime. Mike is also distinguished by his extensive advisory work. His current appointments include Vice President of the U.S. White Collar Crime Research Consortium, member of the European Commission Group of Experts on Corruption, member of the Independent Statistics Advisory Committee, part of the UK Statistics Authority, and member of the Organized Crime Council under the umbrella of the World Economic Forum. On a personal note, I have to say that Mike has certainly had a profound influence on my own work, and I should say that I've been waiting with bated breath for the release of his most recent book, White Collar Crime and Its Victims, allegedly dealing with the media construction of white collar crime, which I think has been forthcoming since 2003? 1992. So as you can imagine, my eager anticipation has abated somewhat of late. However, Mike, you'll be happy to know that according to Amazon.com, the book was actually published in 2006, although there are no copies currently available. During dinner last night, Mike actually noted this is all part of his master plan and that he had always intended for the study to be longitudinal in nature. So it looks like it may actually turn out that way. Before I turn things over to Mike, I want to acknowledge the generous support of our sponsors, the Department of Sociology, Department of Social Science, the Law and Society program, the Nathanson Center, and last but certainly not least, McLaughlin College, our co-sponsors. And I'd like to recognize the contributions of Ian Green, Lorraine, who's at the back, and Lillian, without whose organizational proclivities this event never would have been possible. So thank you very much to all of them. Now, without any further ado, I'll turn things over to Mike, whose talk today, as you can see, is titled Financial Crimes and the Criminalization Process.
Thanks very much. You were kinder to my forthcoming text than I had anticipated. There's actually, I think the longest running forthcoming is a book by Jock Young on the myth of the media, a very appropriate title for a mythical book. But I did actually write 120,000 words of white collar crime and its victims, but the publisher said this was too long. And I've never had time to cut it since, so perhaps I'll just reissue it in its original form as a kind of vanity publication, but thanks for that anyway. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and thanks to my sponsors as well. There's a fine group of scholars here at York, and it's been a pleasure to be amongst them and amongst some of the younger generation. And I think I'm reminded of a comment by Tom Lehrer, which I will adapt. It's a sobering thought that when Mozart was my age, he had been dead for 25 years. So I haven't quite written 41, but perhaps this is the Jupiter lecture that will finalize them. So I thought I'd kind of start with a nice cartoon, a kind of adaptation of Uncle Carl, from each according to their vulnerability to each according to their greed, which I think is a nice metaphorical slogan for our times. Now, I'm going to talk about financial crime. Those of you familiar, which may not be that many, with the work of Claude Lévi-Strauss, no relation except his genes, they will be familiar with the term floating signifier. Those of you who are not will have to make it up and pretend that you are. But financial crime is, I'm going to argue, a floating signifier. It's a term that is analytically devoid of substance, but contains a lot of interesting things, and you can make it mean more or less what you want it to mean. First, it means fraud, or white-collar crime to old people. But first, it means fraud. It includes fraud. Second, perhaps money laundering. Third, market abuse, things like insider dealing. Fourth, the interesting category that some defense industry people now call threat finance, which includes terrorist finance, which was kind of basically bolted on to this stuff after 9/11. Unless something bad happens to the Americans, as you know, it's not serious for anybody anywhere else in the world. And having been in the Old Bailey when the IRA blew it up in 1973, I was familiar with the issues of terrorism and terrorism finance, for that matter. But these things only became part of financial crime after 9/11, but has also more recently been extended to include financing the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, by which, of course, we mean Iran, or Iran, as the Americans would put it. Or as the Private Eye cartoon once put it, after 9/11, the officer is saying, "Looks like Armageddon, sir," to George W. Bush. So that's right, Armageddon out of here. But includes the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Personally, I think it's a good idea for them not to proliferate. But it's certainly not what many people would have thought we might ever mean by financial crime. And then transnational bribery. So there's something here in this great melting pot of crime for everybody. And that's an important thing. There's stuff for the conservative right, the threat finance stuff. There's stuff here for the political left, transnational bribery. Yeah, so you can see how this forms a kind of a coalition of different sorts of political gestalts that might attract everybody. It's a kind of omnibus term, as it now is constituted, of financial crime. And it's important to bear that in mind. So when you think of what people might be meaning when they say financial crime is a very serious topic, which bit of it exactly are they referring to? So to what extent are tax evasion, for example, and corruption, transnational bribery, and cartels included in financial crimes? Well, my argument today is that they're all included. There's room at this financial crime inn for all. However transiently they may be. Because the Financial Action Task Force, who issues its fatwas, has decided this year that transnational bribery, and tax fraud are part of its core mandate now. So we've seen this gradual accumulation of lots and lots of different, often quite disparate things within this rather all-encompassing category of financial crime. Do they make a coherent package? In one sense, it's all about the money, stupid. So in that sense, there's a coherent theme of money. But when you think that 9/11 was the most expensive terrorist incident in history, as far as we can recall, les Canadiens Français perhaps might regard the storming of by Montcalm as an expensive terrorist incident, but we won't go there. But if you think that 9/11 was the most expensive terrorist incident that we know of in history, and that cost about $250,000. I mean, real bucks, American bucks. And that the 7/7 bombings in London cost less than £10,000. You don't need an awful lot of money. That's 8 on average Canadian credit card frauds would do it. Yeah? Thought of in those kind of categories. We're rolling up, fraud which costs billions with terrorist incidents that it's not really a problem the average criminal, the average half-decent criminal could afford to pay for an average terrorist attack. Yeah? So we got some very, very different scaled offenses here. And so I say there's something in this for everyone. Does it make a coherent package? Well, not really. The process of monitoring terrorist finance, there is some big money involved. There are huge donors, mostly in the legitimate sector, who are giving large amounts of money to foster hate. But if we're talking about operational finance, we're talking about tiny sums, as Margaret Beer and others have pointed out, as well as me. So you're talking about crimes both great and small. Even if we take corruption, transnational bribery tends to be big. Acres, the Canadian corporation, there's been a long-running controversy over BAE, which is not officially a case of transnational bribery at all, even though some Saudi high officials received an awful lot of money for the Al Yamama contracts, but that's not officially a transnational bribery. Okay, so if we're counting these forms of behavior, we've got a lot of quite complex things to worry about in our counting process. Let's think about the drivers of this, the political drivers. Sutherland once defined criminology as the study of the processes of making laws, of breaking laws, and society's reaction towards the breaking of laws. And I keep roughly faith with that tradition. The making laws stuff tends to be forgotten by most practicing criminologists, but not by people here. But it's very important to think of making laws, and not just making substantive laws like fraud and money laundering, but also procedural laws, like the laws of evidence, the laws of mutual legal assistance, those kinds of laws. So what are the drivers of this trend that I claim to be talking about? They are, first of all, the pressures for political respectability and trade. One of the extraordinary things that has been created is quite a novel thing for law, which is the process of external evaluation of law. In the olden days, in the good old days, when I was a kid, when the Dead Sea was only slightly sick, in those days there was no real evaluation of law. Countries signed and ratified agreements. That was it. I mean, occasionally there were conflicts of laws. There's enough international law on conflicts of law. There were issues about where the appropriate venue was. But the idea of evaluating a country's performance in how it implemented its law, this is a relatively new phenomenon. We see it in a variety of ways. Of course, the World Trade Organization is one such. But in criminal law used to be just a thing a country did for its own citizens, or against its own citizens, depending what political group you belong to. But now there's a kind of soft law process in place which is evaluating performance in law passing and law implementation. And there are all kinds of bodies that do this. There's the Financial Action Task Force and its FATF-style regional bodies. That's the first category there. The OECD has a corruption, transnational bribery working party. It too evaluates countries. Greco is a European, the Council of Europe group that evaluates members of the Council of Europe for their anti-corruption implementation. And the UN Convention Against Corruption, or UNCAC, rather unfortunate name in my opinion. The UNCAC is the UN's Convention Against Corruption, and it too has state parties evaluation. Sometimes I think, from the perspective of many poor, small countries, that they spend all their resources meeting evaluators, and they have no resource left for doing any actual internal work against corruption and money laundering. Or at least that's their excuse. But there is an issue about the overlapping nature of all these things, because it's all really about money laundering in one form or another. And because the movement of money is part of all these things, and that is the common theme in financial crimes, it follows that whether your primary interest is corruption or fraud or terrorist finance or weapons of mass destruction, you're always going to be seeing, are these countries good enough? And I've got a great quote in an article that has just been published in a World Bank book from a minister in Malawi, met an IMF official, and he said, how's our loan going? He said, oh, well, trouble is you haven't got a financial intelligence unit. But we haven't got a financial services sector. It doesn't matter, you've got to have a financial intelligence unit. Created a financial intelligence unit, they got the loan. So there's an element of ritualism in this, a kind of infrastructural front. Many years ago, I was speaking to the head of the financial intelligence unit in Nigeria and saying, how do you go about your work? And they said, well, we got a good office here. We wait for people to report stuff to us. That's interesting. Yeah, the trouble is not many people are reporting stuff. A third of the qualified accountants in Niger are working in the Financial Intelligence Unit. That cannot be a brilliant idea from the point of view of the economic development of Niger. So we have to think about, we're imposing this model which has many positive features, but we're imposing this model perhaps sometimes without thinking about whether that is the biggest priority facing all the countries who are implementing it. So there's an element of what I've called here pleasing teacher, copying reference groups' processes. And some countries held back from actually enacting anti-money laundering provisions because they didn't want to upset any of their sponsors. Once you've adopted it, where's the aid flow? It's like finding bin Laden. Who the hell wanted to find bin Laden? You get so much aid from the process of finding him. Why should you want to actually find him? Because the flow of money will be cut off. So we have to think about, these are real-world elements of culture and underlying finances that are very important to think about. So basically, what do? You don't have a clue what to do. I did my first money laundering project in 1988, which was before most of you were born. In the course of that study, I was talking to the chair of the British Bankers Association, and I asked him, well, how did you go about kind of dealing with the money laundering problem? He said, in 1985-86, when these laws were first proposed in Britain, they started talking about money laundering. We thought, what's this money laundering? So we contacted the American Bankers Association to find out what it was, and they had some courses. So we learned about money laundering from that. Well, if a country with as sophisticated a financial system as the UK, they may not have known the name money laundering, they knew the practice. But that's a very good example of the way in which kind of borrowing or policy transfer happens even between powerful countries. Canada, I might say, was quite late in on this process. But why? It's because you started getting criticized a lot by the international bodies. And it was time, and it's very embarrassing. You turn up at a G8 meeting or a G20 meeting, people saying, well, what's with your country? We shouldn't sneeze at those social processes. They're a very important part of consensus building. And then the important question is scandal and its consequences. Scandal, and Canadians have had their fair share of scandals, is a very important thing to think about as a driver of behavior, because everybody has to do something nowadays. In the mediatized world in which we live, the former British Prime Minister once said, the art of politics is to avoid making a decision until the decision becomes unnecessary. Who the hell can do that nowadays? You've got to have an instant solution to every problem within 10 minutes of it appearing on rolling news. So what we have is frenetic activity, a bit like some of you writing your essays. You've got you've got an obligation. Something is driving you, and it's often the media that are driving you. So a scandal comes up, you have to have a policy response to that. You can't say, hey, in the context of things, this ain't so bad. Complacency. That's a terrible thing to want to do. So it's very important to have a response. And this is one of the reasons why politicians are so keen on bringing in new laws. They bring laws without thinking about the cost of the implementation, how they're actually going to implement it. So in what sociologists of law used to call symbolic versus instrumental legislation, very often the symbolic purposes of law are very important. It's not that they don't intend ever to actually implement it. It's just that the immediate political imperative is to be seen to be doing something. Then there are pressures from NGOs and other civil society. This has particularly been important in the transnational bribery area. Now, going back to Lester Pearson's days, Canada always had a kind of pretty outreachy view about its role in the world of promoting decency and kind of good corporate governance around the world. It was a view of a kinder, gentler world, for which I suppose is the model for South Park, really. And a kinder, gentler world that Canada was going to help create. Didn't quite make it, but there's been a strong element of non-governmental organizations like Transparency International, like Global Witness, etc. There's a kind of long list of activists getting involved, and they've helped to push this agenda to criminalize transnational bribery, and also to push for the recovery of stolen or corruptly obtained assets. And places like Canada and Norway have been big drivers in that. But there are domestic NGOs, and they've been quite successful. Whether they would have been as successful if the Americans hadn't been so dumb as to pass the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in 1977 in a fit of morality after Watergate and after the Lockheed bribery scandal, which led to the imprisonment of the former Prime Minister of Japan, is another question. But once American corporations were, if you like, affected by the transnational bribery criminalization, they want to make sure that everybody else was in the same place. So again, you've got an interesting alliance between leftists, broadly NGOs, Christian movements, global movements, and major American corporations concerned about the level playing field, which underpins a lot of this. Now, against this, you have counter pressures from elites, corporate, high net worth, that's HNW, and professionals. Yeah. When I first started work on money laundering, people used to talk a lot about customer confidentiality. Nobody talks about customer confidentiality. Maybe in Canada they do. Hardly anybody talks about customer confidentiality anymore. Lawyer-client confidentiality, lawyer confidentiality, yes, but customer confidentiality has more or less disappeared from the rhetoric of public statements. It's no longer kosher to talk about customer confidentiality in polite company. You might, and if you talk about bank secrecy, which used to be a positive term for attracting clients, it's now a term exclusively used by radical leftists and other anti-globalization campaigners. Yeah. Now, banks may still talk about bank secrecy in private to their high net worth clients. But as we've seen from the travails of UBS and other Swiss banks, Wagelin currently awaiting trial in the US, they can't really assure people of that anymore, because faced with the choice between having their banking operations closed down entirely in the US and their executives jailed, bankers like News Corporation tend to surrender their prized confidential assets. So it's a complicated world now, but a world in which large, powerful corporations have been pushed into doing things that they would never have dreamed of that they would ever be pushed into 30 years ago. But do these produce homogeneous global effects? Globalization is one of those grossly overused, also a floating signifier. No is the answer. What it tends to do is to produce similar legislation in most places, because nobody wants to be on a blacklist of non-cooperating countries. Sanctions follow from that. But whether it produces actual homogeneity in practice, this is where we have to ask ourselves, how do we know what we know? And I'll come back to that theme. So responsibilization is a term invented by, the term was invented by David Garland, as far as I can recall, to refer to the way in which the private sector has been incorporated as part of the crime control culture. And so I want to briefly touch upon some themes within that. It seems to me to be useful to split up responsibilization into, first of all, internally generated. Things that a sensible company, whether Hollinger International falls into that category is an interesting question, but would do for itself if it was serious about dealing with harms against it. Yeah? So many frauds happen against corporations. Bad people work their way into corporations. In the words of Milton's Comus, I wind me into the easy-hearted man and trap him into snares. So bad people get jobs in corporations. They either start bad, what I call pre-planned frauds, or they become bad later, whether for taste for fast women and slow horses, or fast boys and slow horses, whatever their temptations. So you need to defend yourself against people like that if you're a rational corporation. So that's what I call pure, maybe it's not corporate social responsibility, but that's a bigger question, but it's individual responsibility. Then there's what I call anticipatory diffusion. Bad stuff, as Lou Reed might have put it, something's happening here. There's bad stuff coming down the track. Government is going to regulate if we don't do something. So we have to defuse the scandal, defuse the problem by taking action, or at least convincingly appearing to take action. The classic thing, if you're in government, is, I'm going to set up an investigation committee. Yeah, we need a committee of inquiry, which hopefully will take it until you leave office. But anticipatory diffusion is a very important thing. So if you've got all these people complaining, we've got to do something, yes, that's a good idea. We'll set up a working party. Or there's enforcement reactive self-regulation. When legislation, if we take the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act as an example, you second guess, this is about gaming the system. You second guess what you expect to be the reactions of regulators or cops. And you devise strategies for dealing with that. If we could see it in the way, in the context, for example, of James Williams' work on regulating abuses in the financial sector. People know there is legislation out there. There's some chance of something bad happening to you, so you've got to have a system in place. And what's been interesting, and where I think there has been some level of harmonization, is because of the transnational obligations under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and now under the UK Bribery Act of 2010, which we passed because we were fed up with being pilloried by the OECD, by the media, by NGOs, etc. We had to do something. And that has quite a lot of transnational impact. So a British company anywhere in the world, unless you've got systems in place that can show that you did your very best genuinely to stop this bribery happening, and you have systems of monitoring in place, then you are liable. Just like under the American legislation. There are ways out. I don't have time to get too technical here, but you'll be pleased to know. But this is enforcement reactive. If you ask yourself the question, if it wasn't for the U.S. Department of Justice, would much of this stuff be happening? The answer is no. Because the opposite is what happened in the UK, in the BAE case, where, as I pointed out in a letter to the Home Secretary, it's difficult to say that English legislation is satisfactory. There hasn't been a single prosecution for transnational bribery since the 1906 law was passed. That must be either because nobody reports it, or two, if somebody reports it, the police don't pick it up, or if the police do a report, the prosecutors decide not to prosecute. If any of those conditions obtain, you can't really say that, which was the Home Secretary's position at that time, that the law, we've got a perfectly adequate law in place. There's no evidence that it's adequate. Depends where you start from. So enforcement reactive self-regulation depends on there being a perception of some real enforcement. Corporations have got to see pain unless they can band amongst themselves and actually agree a process, which is what people are trying to do with the transparency initiatives in many areas of activity, like oil and etc. Natural resources. It's complicated by the arrival of the Chinese. But the extractive industries have got a transparency project now. You can be cynical and say, this is nonsense. They're not serious, but they're semi-serious. But they're semi-serious because if they don't, they're going to suffer not just reputational harm, but also a risk of prosecution for their transnational practices. So in that way, the world has changed and is less heterogeneous than it was. I won't say it's homogeneous, but it's less heterogeneous. There's also an issue about discourses of risk and harm. I say financial crime is a very broad category. There is a problem, whose problem? of persuading media and public to take some financial crime seriously. There may be one or two people here, perhaps everyone, who has downloaded stuff from pirate websites. Just one or two, maybe. Of course, that's intellectual property crime. And if the authorities had their way, you would be getting letters informing you that you were violating those rules and that you were going to be, you stood a risk of prosecution or having your access to the internet cut off. I'm not quite sure how they do that. You know, it's sort of electronic castration. Just invented that term. I should have left it. I should have left it in the locker. So electronic castration is what they would wish on you for downloading file sharing. And legislation was put forward in the US Congress. I'm not pursuing this electronic castration theme. In the US Congress, which was rejected because the old Hollywood moguls had failed to count on the Googles of this world having power, as well as young people's protests, because young people, disempower that form of legitimacy. They regard it as illegitimate, by and large, to have to pay for any of this stuff. Of course, authors like us, some of us, may disagree, but frankly, if I had to rely on income from sales of my books, frankly, I can always content myself. The reason my income from books is so small is because all these people are pirating it. I only wish it were true. But self-deception is very important. So IP counterfeiting, contraband of licit products. I say licit, not tobacco. Frauds against financial services, and particularly against the European Union. These are all things that most people and the media don't take that seriously. So how do you bump up their seriousness? You have to associate these underappreciated acts with other signals of harm. Bad people, mafia-type, terrorists commit them. Bad people use the funds from them to finance other more serious crimes. Fraud may not be serious, but they use fraud, the proceeds of fraud, for drug trafficking. Do they? What moron would do drugs if they could do fraud? So stupid. If you're smart enough to get away with fraud, why would you do something risky like be a drugs trafficker? What's the evidence base for this? Yeah? I mean, it does happen, believe me, because people like excitement, and being a fraudster can be exciting. But, if you're in the drug scene, you got all this stuff going down with musicians, women, men. It's the life. So it's not purely an anal, rational process of Protestantism and capital accumulation. People actually, believe me, criminals do things for fun because they find it exciting. So it's not as stupid as it seems to think that they sometimes do finance drugs trafficking from fraud. But as a rational process, that would be a pretty dumb thing to do if all you were interested in was money and safety from jail. And they use proceeds of crime to fund terrorism. Well, maybe because of terrorist finance controls. In a way, that's the objective, to drive people from financing terrorism from legitimate stuff, because they're scared of being prosecuted for terrorist finance into crime, which is a riskier activity, particularly street crime, which might lead you to actually being picked up and coming to the attention of the authorities. And finally, the argument is legitimate people have to pay more for services, which they do. I mean, in the crash for cash insurance, frauds have certainly bumped up the cost of motor insurance for those people who don't participate in them. Yeah, I mean, I've been doing work on that area. So there's a legitimate argument there. Or our personal space is violated. People, if you want a little natural experiment, just do a Google News search for identity theft or identity fraud. Yeah? You'll see a lot of stuff that touches that populist psyche. People really do get upset. Somebody's pretending to be me. I only wish there were more imitators myself. But it's just regarded as an index of personal popularity. But if somebody is getting credit in your name and not paying, and as Oscar Wilde once observed, the only way one can hope to remain in the memory of the commercial classes is not paying one's bills. And you do. You remain on experience files for quite some time. So it does upset people, not just because it impacts on their credit record, because they don't like the idea of somebody out there pretending to be them. So identity theft and identity fraud. But it's not theft in the normal sense. You don't lose your identity. It's identity duplication. It's not like somebody's stolen your money and you no longer have it. You still have it, just somebody else has it. I mean, isn't that what Second Life and all these kind of games is all about? So you've got an avatar, you've got a fan out there, but people aren't as relaxed about that. And cybercrime. You only have to have an E at the end before anything to make it immediately harmful. It's scary for enforcement types. It's kind of E additive. So we might think about very different types of financial crime and offender relationships. And you can regard them in interest groups, or what we used to call in the old days class terms, in terms of who were affected by different types of crime. I'll just mention the last category. IP theft, intellectual property theft, might be thought to benefit mostly illegitimate ones, but you only have to look at the amount of corporate espionage. Trying to poach people with insider knowledge from different companies to realize that it's not just the Swedish file-sharing sites that are making a significant amount of money. Or there's one case, a British student financed himself very comfortably through college by offering this site, and the Americans, as the Americans do, are now keen to extradite him. They just like people, the Americans. They want to bring them back from all over the world at no expense. So it's not just about that kind of thing when you think about intellectual property. It's also intercorporate competition. So I'd qualify the last bit. So who's ranged against this? And I'm winding up slowly, or winding down slowly. You'll be pleased to know there'll be a break. Intelligence gatherers, public and private. This is one big area. James Williams and Margaret have been doing work on this. This is one important area where the private and the public are interacting in novel ways. commercial incapacitators and preventers. We don't normally think about it in this way, but if we take Visa and MasterCard, they have data aggregation people, they have mechanisms, and so does Dun & Bradstreet in commercial credit, of looking for suspicious behavior, looking for behavior that is out of the ordinary, that represents highly risky behavior. And they have highly developed technologies for doing this. And there are also software companies that are now selling a lot of this software. And the aim is to, like in incapacitation and criminology, to stop people being able to carry out their plans by cutting them off. So, for example, if you're a trader and all of a sudden in your firm you suddenly start getting 20% of the credit cards you put through are stolen or counterfeit, then they will close you down because they will correctly judge probably that you are corrupt. So they will stop you from continuing in that business. Then there are criminal enforcers who have more problems with some financial crimes than others. Again, James has written very cogently about this in the context of the IMETs and the RCMP. Criminal enforcement is a big issue in most countries. Even the Americans don't convict everybody. Well, they normally scare them into pleading guilty because of the consequences for sentencing, which is one reason why Brits don't like being exported to the US. Then there are professional regulators. Canada has some special issues because it's a provincial thing. There's a kind of national provincial issue. Intergovernmental organizations like the IMF, the World Bank, who are doing lots and lots of projects and technical assistance. Civil society, whistleblowers, and whistleblower protection is aimed at, whether it actually succeeds, is aimed at generating more complaints. Because whistleblowers do tend to be, whatever the law says, disliked. You go back to Ibsen's play Enemy of the People. This has a long history, this distrust of people complaining for the public benefit against their organization. The national, international media and markets, this is a big, big change. There are not only groups of investigative journalists around the world who help to support each other. Once something appears somewhere, electronic media, people can pick it up everywhere. You can't insulate stories nationally in the way that you used to. Not for those who are motivated, but if you took the number of Americans who know what Bhopal is, for your information, it was a big explosion in India that led to many, many people being killed and hundreds of thousands poisoned in a company owned by Union Carbide, now part of Dow Chemical. People might have been able to pick that up electronically, but how many people would have the motivation? Certainly isn't on Fox News. So you can overplay this, but the information's available. The issue about whether people are really interested or care is another issue. But News International, News Corporation, the Murdoch Empire, the Hollinger Empire that was, people, you can't suppress stuff so easily now. And finally, the voting public. Who cares? What kind of white-collar crimes or other financial crimes do people really care about? They actually affect whether they're likely to vote for you or give you their money if you're a politician. So that's a big range of people, and you notice it's got very little to do, most of it, with criminal enforcement. In that sense, the world of financial crime control is a very, very much more complicated place than it was. So the new politics, all these pigs with in the trough, we will curb excess. Well, they've got to say that. But let's, finally, as I wind down, what are the uneven steps to harm reduction? First of all, there's a lot of coordination of public sector fraud reduction. Perhaps not quite as advanced in Canada as in some countries. Even within Europe, there's a lot of variation. There's this push towards private sector responsibilization. In the UK, I mean, this depends, and this is the importance of law, this depends, first of all, on corporate vision, but it also depends on data sharing legislation, privacy protection, whether you can do this stuff. But in the UK, we have an insurance fraud bureau, which pools every accident in the whole of the UK on which there is a claim. And every person, every telephone number, every address. Witnesses, people claiming to be injured, drivers, they're all put together in this giant electronic pot, and their interconnections are electronically searched out to build up portraits of criminal networks or suspected criminal networks. And they have internal investigators looking at this in quite a sophisticated way. You know, so all because of the rise of crash for cash. You know, lots of people, if you have, how common is it that 4 people in a car all have whiplash injuries? Yeah? It's not very common in the real world, but in the world of claims, it's increasingly common. Even if they were never in the car in the first place, even if there never was a crash. So partly in response to this, and partly, of course, you could call it a moral panic, there's data pooling for this purpose. There's a body, CIFAS in England. Everybody who applies for credit gets assessed against a list of known or suspected fraudsters in previous cases on their name, date of birth, telephone numbers. Yeah, so this is becoming, electronic data pooling is becoming a really big thing. I've mentioned fraudulent merchants. Closing down when fraud signs appear. We're starting to go after criminal enablers. So there was a fraudulent credit card site called Dark Market, which was infiltrated by the FBI and by Brits, and closed it down. What's the impact? Tricky question. But it was certainly a method, because the point about e-communication is it has to be recorded somewhere. It's not like meeting somebody in a pub, where if there's no cameras on or no informants there, it's a private relationship. There's an electronic signal somewhere, if people can get into it. And so infiltration becomes an issue, jurisdiction cooperation, police meetings. And then we have, and I'll skip over some of the slides next just to wind up, the decline of the public sphere. So what role, how important is criminal enforcement? So if we think about what do private and public sector need police for, perhaps stimulating intra-private sector cooperation. There's something, the RCMP or Scotland Yard invites you to a meeting. Most business people think that's cool. Of course, they may not, but But they think that's cool. We want you to enlist cooperation and stuff. Well, a lot of people think that's cool, and they're happy to go along with it. Receiving developed investigations, these bodies I was telling you about make some searches and arrests. Private people can't, in general, make arrests. They can't do cross-border. They can't put you an Interpol red notice on you. And corruption investigations. What do the police need from the private sector? They want their conscription. If you're trying to cut down on internet pornography, then the cops need them to close down payment card fraud, payment card opportunities, yeah? Because you can't have electronic commerce. You can have private sending of stuff between friends or between vetted insiders, but you can't have a business without transferring funds. They want them to track individuals' businesses and all these kinds of groups, and they want them for operational funding. Whole units in the case of the UK. Banks pay for a credit card fraud unit. Insurance industry pays for an insurance fraud unit. These are police units paid for entirely by the private sector because the cops won't pay for them. And we have, what are the limits of all this process? Well, who can afford to pay for it? How much nerve do the authorities have to clamp down on banking misconduct? They're afraid the banks might, or the other major corporations might leave the country if they impose too many rules. Depends how important a market it is. A market like Canada, natural resource accepted, is not that important as a kind of retail body, so people might leave. UK, the weather's nice. There are good schools. You can buy yourself a nice house where you don't need to talk to any of the wrong people. That's why Russians like it. So there are those kinds of issues, but how much might they leave? What would happen to our economy if they did? Those are the kind of worrying things. And so they try and encourage buy-in by involving business, cooperative arrangements, use reputational risk to create a virtuous conscription circle, and try and balance criminal and regulatory enforcement in ways that we don't quite understand. So what's the end game? When we had Irish terrorism, we used to think it was success if they just turned to organized crime and stopped blowing us up. So perhaps one measure of success might be if Osama, were he still alive, and who knows, forget terrorism, I'm going to become an accountant. Maybe that's a measure not of total success, but of partial success, of harm reduction. And what we're seeing is a lot of the unevennesses in the world are shrinking. A lot of the national autonomy over legislation and over enforcement is shrinking. It hasn't disappeared by any chalk, and we don't have an adequate mechanism really for assessing performance in this. It's the next big challenge for many of us, is to work out how you could tell if things were getting better or worse, or what that constitutes. These are questions that we've only begun to think about seriously. So perhaps some of you in this room today who've had to sit through me rambling on for far too long might want to pick up that challenge and crime. Let's crack it together. Thank you.
Thank you for that very stimulating talk, Professor Levy. I'm curious about the backgrounds of people who engage in certain of these crimes. For example, are they people that engage in credit card fraud? Do they tend to be MBAs, high school dropouts, intelligent people who dropped out in their third year university? Do you know, are they male, female? What is known about their backgrounds?
Okay, well, the average York University student might manage it, even faculty member. One of my interests is, in fact, what does it take to do these things? What skills do you have to have, including social skills, by the way, and people you know. What networks do you have to have, or can you acquire them? That, for me, is the core of studies of the organization of crime, which I pontificate about in the Oxford Handbook of Criminology and elsewhere. But we know that they're mostly male, but there's no reason why females can't do credit card fraud. There's a reason why they can't do frauds committed by financial directors, because there aren't many of them. But credit card fraud is an equal opportunity crime. Particularly, in the days when before chip and pin, when all you had to do is to go in and sign. Of course, if you had a woman's credit card, by and large, you had to be a woman, or at least be more plausibly like one than I am. Although I did, as an experiment in one of my studies, I took my mother, his name was Brenda Margarita Levi. I did take her card, having sorted it with the local authorities first, and committed the offense of counterfeiting by writing her signature in some of our department stores. And nobody questioned it. Yeah, why would they? Had a signature. It wasn't rejected by the electronic system. If these things were more commonly rejected, it would be so you could even cross gender and cross ethnicity is more of a problem. But it depends on people looking and being willing to challenge. Chip and pin has altered that. You now need more technology than you did. But there's no reason why it should be gender biased. But at least as far as we know, most offenders are male. Typically, in the case of credit card fraud, youngish, though I did interview one person in his 50s who had done Rod Stewart's gold card for several £100,000 by pretending to be part of his security detail. So the bills were coming back from all the places where Rod was. So it's about disarming techniques. As far as the corporate fraudsters go, they tend to be people who've been at the firm for quite a long time, suggesting they're more in my category of slippery slope or intermediate fraudsters than people who planned it all along. Some of the, if we take Conrad Black as an example, well, in his teens he broke into the study and took the exam questions which he sold based on need, i.e. how desperate his fellow students were to get the answers, would determine the price. So that was an early example of rational cost-benefit analysis. Because the more desperate they were, the higher the price that the other kids at his private school were to pay for the stuff. So some people seem to be serial, as R.D. Hare at UBC calls them, serial psychopaths, or sociopaths. who, in the words of one fraudster I interviewed, was so crooked he couldn't even lie straight in bed. So, you do get these serial fraudsters who really just can't stop because they like it. But it depends on the type of crime and what you need to be able to do in order to commit it.
Is it okay if I don't have a microphone?
Yep. Well, I can hear.
The beginning of the talk and the end of the talk, and I'm not quite sure if this is going to be a very coherent question, but...
Wasn't coherent paper, so...
So think about this idea of financial crimes you start out as being a floating signifier. So it's a very broad, heterogeneous group of activities that are clumped together. And I'm trying to think about that, but towards the end when you're talking about crime reduction or crime management and policing, it seems to me that it kind of returned to something of a confusion. I might categorize them differently as crimes against a corporation as opposed to crimes by a corporation. Right? So you mentioned anything ranging from like Opal to Cash for Crash, and I think those porn websites in there, which I'm not sure are even criminal in most instances.
Well, they are if they're for underage.
Yeah, so that, but then it's not necessarily a financial crime, it's a crime against a different. But anyway, so it's not just a difference of scale, but I'm wondering about linking that to the process of criminalization and whether the symbolic process of criminalization and all these evaluating bodies offer sort of an ideological message that these are equalized, that these are sort of of the same scale, so it's false, it sort of gives a false homogeneity to what I might categorize as very different kinds of activities.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I'll try and give it almost as good an answer. You're certainly correct that the technologies I was talking about mostly relate to crimes against corporations. And that's why they find it so easy to band together to share stuff. But there is a lot of, the anti-money laundering, for example, and anti-corruption is big business. Private consulting firms are always whipping up fears amongst corporates that unless they change themselves in certain important ways, change themselves with expensive advice, they will, suffer terrible consequences. And that has an element of technology because in the, as far as account management is concerned, there's a lot of technology goes into generating triggers of suspicious, of out-of-the-way transactions. So let's just take a case to illuminate this for the majority here, probably don't know a lot about this kind of stuff. Let's say you as a student have an account. Now, it's probably not got very much in it. Yeah? It's a hypothesis. If it is, you're keeping quiet, right? Because you don't want to become a victim of identity crime. So you're keeping quiet. All of a sudden, you put, say, 200,000, even Canadian dollars worth something, 200,000 Canadian dollars in cash, or a wire transfer in from, say, your uncle's flower business in Colombia. Then boom, boom, boom. Electronically, this is not what we're expecting for this student. And it throws out something which a compliance officer inside the bank has to deal with. The easiest thing for them to do is to pass it on to FinTrack. Well, it does it, if it's electronically, it does that anyway. The easiest thing, whether anything then happens, is not their problem. So there's a lot of electronics, even stuff, now the bank by itself in the olden days wouldn't care. You were supposed to attract funds. What's the problem? But now this is a risky thing for them, and somebody might turn around and say, well, why didn't you pay attention to that? Just like the Canadian bank who paid out $17 million yesterday or whenever it was to the people it wasn't negligent about. But it cares. So there's a lot of that even stuff that isn't so purely in self-interest, but you are quite right that it does create the appearance of fairness, and it's certainly true that if you worked in the audit department for Hollinger International and you got a request to transfer some funds on behalf of Lord Black, for example, to fund a birthday party bash in some foreign exotic place, were you to say no, as Nancy Reagan recommended, then you would be short of it. You would certainly be looking for a job very, very fast. So in those kinds of sectors, the culture of masculinity rules, and relative power rules, and this is where that financial crime stuff. Now, you might become a whistleblower and report it. Whether you ever get a job again remains doubtful. So that's a partial answer. The ideological thing, I don't think it's constructed self-consciously like that. But it is part of the sort of Gramscian hegemony. It's individual pressure groups pushing for particular things. And the easiest thing, unless you've got a good chance of defeating it, is to pass it and then not enforce it. Now the question about what gets resources to be enforced and how competent those things, that then becomes the next stage. So you can strangle, I'll give you an example. One of my ex-students was deputy director of the Anti-Corruption Bureau in Zambia. In common with many African countries, they don't really have enough money to travel outside the capital. So they want to interview somebody. They don't have fax machines. Well, it's not the case for Zambia, but some other countries don't have fax machines or the internet. So obviously you can't do a lot if you don't have those things. So that's the less visible stage. And that's a research problem for many of us in getting access to that reality on the ground. Okay.
We do need people to come to the microphone because we're recording this for posterity. So the best thing for people, if they have questions, is to just line up at the microphone, if you would, please.
More of a comment than a question, and I'll ask for your view on this. This is something I've been thinking about today, about one of the things that may lead to more financial crime, or falling into the category of financial crime, is that we tend to monetize more and more things. And I'll give you a very concrete example that we're debating here in Canada in universities about copyright and fair use. And I just was reading about how University of Toronto, our sister institution, signed an agreement with I'm not sure what the organization that is responsible for providing copyright in Canada. And the agreement was that University of Toronto reached an agreement on fair copyright use, but part of the agreement was that professors' emails could be monitored in case they were sending to students hyperlinks. Now, that kind of monitoring suggests that if you send a student a hyperlink without authorization, you're committing a financial crime. And that's because more and more things are monetized, like intellectual property. So would you agree that there is this increase in financial crime in part because we're monetizing more and more things?
Yes, I think that's a really good observation. Yeah, I think it is true. And in a sense, if you think about the history of Facebook, etc., the challenge for them is to do what Apple has done so successfully, which is to monetize things, and now they appear to be. But I mean, there's a false .com boom, but it's true that people are selling the data as well. What is it Google is making money from? A lot of it is about the monetization of our behavioral transactions to fine-tune advertisements. So that too is monetization, even without the particular slant that you've given it in your comment. So yeah, you always have to look in any set of data. Those of us who actually use data, a very old-fashioned thing to do, is to think, well, what artificial things could be responsible for this rise? And could that explain any change, either rise or fall? Now, policing authorities are, and institutions are always quick to claim, oh yes, there's a rise, but that shows people got greater confidence in us, even if there's no evidence for that proposition. Whether it's sexual assaults, oh yeah, it's a good thing, shows people got more confidence. You need some baseline judgment, and part of that baseline judgment is a before and after awareness of, well, how did things work then? And some of the claims of changes in this sphere, as Margaret, and other, Tom Naylor, other Canadian colleagues are fond of pointing out, is the claims for the scale of some of these are just incredible. I mean, lack any real analytical base. And to be fair, organizations like FinTrack are much more careful and self-critical about the use of that data. But once a bit of information, however ill-constructed, enters the media sphere, it just gets repeated by what I was telling the group yesterday, what we call facts by repetition. And it's very, very hard to get rid of it, however ill-advised. So estimates of what the proportion of GDP that is accounted for by money laundering are largely nonsensical. And no sensible person should take any notice of them whatsoever. That doesn't mean to say that money laundering is not a bad thing or one shouldn't do something about it. But it's just that in order to get attention, people are driven to make up huge or at least estimate huge figures, because otherwise they won't get the resources they need. So we need to be much more sophisticated as a polity in assessing the what lies behind the data, and not be so dependent on large figures in order to do something about bad things. But I certainly agree with you. I think it's a very profound point about the monetization, and also about the range of things that can now be monitored, which weren't before. And there's been a big fuss in Europe about Google's new privacy rules, the opposite of privacy actually, for integrating all their different function. And the European Union Commissioner of Justice has given her provisional opinion that this is unlawful under EU privacy legislation. So, we await the outcome. It'll take years.
You need to come over here.
Follow the rules. they apply even to the professoriate.
Yeah, I guess so.
It's an equal society.
I'm just interested in some of your work with the UK Statistics Authority, and I'm just wondering if you could maybe shed a little bit of light on whether there are efforts ongoing to try and, I don't know if improve is the word, but maybe change the way in which some of these types of crimes are counted and measured from a statistical point of view, and how that feeds into some of your analyses.
Yeah, well, this appointment just happened in November, and we've had a couple of meetings. But I guess I was appointed to try and beef up the financial crime statistics, particularly fraud and e-crime, which the national statistician was very critical of the Home Office for failing to. I mean, we have more so than in Canada a sophisticated victimization survey instruments that have been going for some years, and the Home Office, it's fair to say, displayed relatively little interest in fraud, or most types of fraud, excepting credit card and identity fraud, until very, very recently, and e-crime, almost none at all. So we haven't got there yet, but when the restructuring comes up, then it will be part of my role to see if we can develop some better measures and also integrate at the moment, and I'm not sure about the state of Canadian statistics, all I know is that it's very, very expensive to get any data out of Statistics Canada, which I find absolutely extraordinary, that you have to pay for what should be publicly available free information. I think that's, if I may say so as a guest, a disgrace upon the Canadian public who are paying for this service and are entitled to the data without paying for it. So data, for example, even on fraud sentencing, which I was once interested in. We had a francophone colloque in Quebec about, I was trying to get the French, the Canadian sentencing statistics in fraud, and I was told that I have to pay for them. Well, I just find that incredible. So Canadians can do something about that if you wish. But because the consequence is people don't use the data if they've got to pay for it. But we have very expensive victimization surveys, which cost a fortune. It doesn't look at those kinds of crimes. We also we have a division, the non-police agencies, like Revenue and Customs and Trading Standards, prosecute people for financial crime offenses, but they're not in the crime statistics. They're in the justice statistics. So coming back to your question about what kind of people are committing, we ought to be thinking about integrating these more than we did, because then we'd have a better evidence base. It still, of course, wouldn't contain who are the undetected people who get away with financial crimes. It wouldn't contain them. But the victimization data should at least be a lot better for individuals and corporations and the public sector. So we're in a better state in Britain than in most countries, but in the US it's very poor. And one of the things that my group in the US is trying to do is to get the FBI to, if you look at the FBI statistics, the Uniform Crime Reports, you get any amount of detail on bank robbery. Who cares about bank robbery? Well, people who are in the banks do. But it's not a big, John Dillinger, once upon a time, it was important. But there's almost nothing there about bank fraud. Which is extraordinary. So even in terms of the now you can construct an ideological tale that they don't want people to think about stuff like that. So why does Britain, which is a capitalist country, do it then? So, it's not just ideological, it's a state of mind, which I suppose is ideology. But it's a state of mind, and what we demand information about as citizens that indirectly or directly we pay for is important.
I guess one of the things that I was interested in that you were talking about was, and in fact you're talking about right now, those areas that one tends not to think about in terms of being massively lucrative for criminals. And as you said in your talk, we sort of all get sort of obsessed with drug trafficking. As you know, Ontario is in the midst of a task force on insurance fraud, and you mentioned your UK bureau. Again, one of the problems that we have here in Ontario is the fact that the various industries that are being exploited own the data. So we've been now trying to sort of get access and get some sense of how accurate the Insurance Bureau of Canada's data is. I mean, it's been quite ludicrous because they're doing their own study. Ontario has hired a group to oversee the group that they have hired to oversee, and at the end of the day, we're still not going to know. And I was just wondering whether the Insurance Bureau in the UK has a greater ability to have a hands-on sort of direct access to the data without relying on the industry deciding what's going to be exposed.
Yes, good question. The Insurance Fraud Bureau is an industry body. It's not a public body, it's a private body, but it's a private body that has been set up by the industry for their mutual benefit. And as I say, it integrates all the data for every accident, and it will be expanding to cover travel and other areas of claims, because this is basically a software methodology issue. And then, of course, they produce cases which they then have to go out and try and persuade the cops to deal with. It's like many areas of organized crime. In that sense, you can produce as many intelligence packages as you like. If the cops are too busy or don't have the expertise to take them up, then nothing happens, which is why they're paying for their own public police force to take on the cases that they've now generated. But if we come back to the question, the data they provide is not accessible to others. I mean, I got access to it, but only, only in part. I mean, I don't have the time. I can't sit around in the Insurance Fraud Bureau. It's not transportable. It's in a particular location. Does the public, do the public authorities have access to all that stuff? The answer is no. And so when they make the claim that, the average person is paying, say, 60 or 80 Canadian dollars a year in their insurance policy, how do we test that claim? The answer is we can't. So it's a question of whether you believe, at the moment it's a question of whether you believe that. Now, if the media or politicians are saying, well, we don't believe you, show us your data, your huddled masses, then they might be pushed into making that available. But it's not available. But I find it plausible, but that's my judgment. Maybe I'm a lackey of the industry here. But it's quite a task to work those. But it's right that we are skeptical about those claims. Likewise, the Canadians do it more now than they used to, but the British banks for a long time have produced data on credit card fraud. I mean, going back to before my first study in 1990. And I believe those data. They got no reason either particularly to fix them, but of course it doesn't tell you about the corrupt expenses and other offshore accounts, deals of bank directors. So, so in that sense, what information do we have about things? It depends on what they're allowed to do, but this is private space. Our revels are now ended. Those I told you were all spirits and now are vanished into thin air, and like an insubstantial pageant faded, leave not a rack behind. I suppose, or alternatively, now is the winter of our discontent, made glorious summer by this son of York. Which would be an appropriate note on which for me to end.